Welcome. My name is Lindsay Evans. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Global Marketplace Diversity Leader for IBM and run business development specific for LGBTQ plus communities. Was the first team in existence to run a team dedicated to that for our community. We're now expanding out to all 8 of our Be Equal communities. I'm very excited to announce that. I'm quite blessed, privileged. After sitting up here yesterday, I'm feeling a little more confident within my neurodivergent self, let me say. Thank you. But really, really excited to have this conversation. So I first want to start with, we do things a little bit differently, right? When we start looking at diversity and inclusion. And the first thing is not going to be an accommodation or an undue hardship. It's going to be some careful consideration for inclusion for all humanity, regardless if you are neurodivergent or neurotypical. We all need things in a different way, right? So we're going to start by lowering the lights a little bit, please, and thank you. You may also notice that our mics are affixed. We may have some voices that are a little more quiet versus mine that can be a little louder. Again, lots of diversity up here on the panel. So if you cannot hear in the back, I encourage you to come up and get close to your friends and family here and fill in some seats. We do apologize if you can't hear in the back, but we're not going to elevate the voices any higher. Okay, so I'm gonna get started. Again, absolute privilege to welcome and introduce panel today. I have Carolyn Ladd with Dow Chemical, Jace Robles of IBM, and Michelle Zelmio with John Deere. Ready? So first, I'd like to ask Michelle, could you please introduce yourself and maybe give us a little insight on what being neurodivergent means to you?
Yeah, hi, I am Michelle, and I am a non-binary human. I was diagnosed with autism pretty recently, around 6 months ago, which is not a super unusual occurrence for people born female. So I want to start with what neurodiverse versus neurodivergent means. Neurodivergent applies to a single human. It is the opposite or a difference from neurotypical. And then neurodiverse describes a group of people, so that a group of people that includes both neurodivergent and neurotypical people to come together to have a lot of different viewpoints. So neurodivergent is one person, neurodiverse is a group. And for me, being neurodivergent means a lot of times it's talked about from the outside looking in about how we present to others, but I want to talk about how it presents in our own community. So when I think of neurodivergence, I think of the immense amount of support and resources that I get from people who have similar experiences to me, and how I can just enter that space and not be met with the same assumptions or misconceptions that I have other people. So a different level of understanding that makes me feel like I have a family.
Thank you. Jace, what about you?
Hi everyone, I'm Jace Robles. I'm an Asian, cisgender, bisexual, newly proud, neurodivergent woman. I'll tell you why later on. For me, being neurodivergent, recently, it wasn't recent, I was diagnosed with bipolar 2 years ago, and it wasn't until recently that I started to become proud of it. And for me, it really means having the difference in the way that our bodies function, and that it's not something that can easily be altered, as some people might think. Now, my day-to-day would probably look a little similar than yours, but with a little caveat that when I'm not on medication, my heart, it beats so much faster throughout the day. So imagine what that can look like for different triggers or scenarios that I encounter every day at work. So for me, that's what it means.
Thank you so much. Carolyn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carolyn Ladd, and I use they, ze pronouns. I'm a research chemist at Dow, and I'm currently working on some sustainable routes to help us decarbonize and grow, which I think is important to bring up, because when I think about what it means to operate in a space where neurodivergent people are accepted, it means providing the brain power that we need to solve many global problems we're facing today. And so that is a reason why I want to really advocate for this community, because of that. And I myself, I am a non-binary, neuroqueer, and proudly autistic human. I also was late diagnosed. It was suspected by a very close friend about 4 years ago. I didn't think that's what autism was. And now having an official diagnosis, I can say being neurodivergent means being free. It means understanding why my experiences were different and why some things were harder, but also starting to understand how my brain operates and being able to, share and support other people within our community.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Since you've had this kind of newfound discovery and this understanding further of sense of self, how has it rather changed maybe how you view your authentic self? And how does that present for you now in the workplace with newfound knowledge?
I think authenticity in itself is kind of a complex topic. I think you can think about it in, I guess, 3 ways. I think I really like this article by Professor Herminina Ibarra about the authenticity paradox, and she kind of breaks it down a little bit and talks about how one core component is, the parts of ourselves that we can bring to work. But let's be honest, we can't always. There's often times that we do need to mask, and we do feel like we have to cover because it's not necessarily safe to show all those parts of ourselves. And so there's also the aspect of, being true to your core values in what you do and having, doing value-based approaches. How it's affected me, honestly, I think it's still quite challenging for me to bring my authentic self to work. This is not really, being unkind to Dow. I think Dow is an amazing place and they've worked very hard on that. I think it just really highlights that there's a lot of lack of information for our community and how to support people who are autistic. And so, yeah, I think for me, being authentic in the workplace is kind of doing my best every day, finding spaces where I have trust and psychological safety and managers, allies, and peers who acknowledge and support me for my full self as an autistic, non-binary person.
I couldn't agree more with the psychological safe space component. I think anyone in this room would agree, despite the chaos that we've had in the last couple of years, shifting to hybrid allowed so many people to engage and re-engage in different ways of working. And although these may have been accommodations in the past, right? This is now the reality. And although we have to be mindful of making sure that those safe spaces are available virtually, especially for all of our friends and family though that's the only safe space they have into our workspaces, especially and in their local regions, but more so for the neurodivergent and autistic communities. That's very much how I've been able to bloom personally in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that. Thank you, Carolyn. Michelle, what's the authentic self look like for you?
So for me, masking is a large part of my workday as well. I've had a lot of roles where I'm an accountant, so I support other business units and help them manage budgets and things like that. And a lot of times in those meetings, there are a lot of things that I say that are misconstrued just because I said them in a more monotone or I wasn't smiling when I said them, because my body language is fundamentally different from other people. And they're receiving it in their lens of how they do their body language instead of being open to other people's, which is normal and everyone does it. But in those situations, I usually have to kind of spend a lot of time thinking afterwards, okay, like what exactly did I say? And because I cannot fundamentally interpret that things, oftentimes I'm kind of left not knowing and just being confused and slightly angry. So in those situations, I usually have to disclose my status as an autistic person, but there are some times where that's not necessarily in my best interest to do so. But if I don't, then it can just continue to escalate. So I have to put myself in a lot of situations with disclosure that I would prefer not to. In my ideal world, I could just communicate how I communicate. People listen to the words I say and don't enter with assumptions. And we all communicate in the best way for us and have an open mind.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much. Jace, you and I have had a teen amount of conversations about bringing authenticity into the workforce and for us in our roles at IBM. But what does that look like for you since we started having conversations about neurodivergency?
So I've been with IBM 12 years, and like I said, I didn't have any idea that I was bipolar. And to me, thankful to IBM for being able to express myself because of what being able to express my authentic self. And a day would mean maybe dancing on the floor because I feel so energetic. So being bipolar is really categorized by a long-term manic phase followed by a depressive phase. So in days where I am manic, sometimes I would really go to the floor, talk to my peers, to my teammates, and literally dance. I didn't know that it was because I was being manic. I just thought I was being authentic, being energetic. And at times where I would be depressed, I would still go to work, but my energy would really look very different. And that was okay. To me, knowing that that was okay, that I wasn't confusing my teammates, which actually happened in the past until such time that I got to know about myself further, that was being authentic. Being able to, I guess, state my ideas, my opinions in a very passionate manner, not because I just want people to take it in, but because I was just being very passionate about my perspectives. So to me, that's that.
Thank you so much. So when we talk about bringing your authentic self to work, we really start to dive in right into policies and practices and taking some barriers and some bias out of those to make sure that everyone has an open door to be able to express themselves at work. I'd like to dive in a little bit in those specific policies and practices and experience up here on the panel on what really is effectively promoted neurodiversity in the respective workforces and workplaces and how that's resonated for them. Jace, could you start?
Sure. So it wasn't until World Bipolar Day this year that I really had the courage to talk about being bipolar. And it was because of a community within IBM, which I think is very important, either for the neurodiversity community, the LGBT community, women, PWD, for all communities, to have that safe space to be able to be just ourselves. So when I was diagnosed, I was crushed. To those who were at the Gayshan session yesterday, I talked about how there are certain expectations to an eldest Filipina who is part of a very big clan who's supposed to help with the family in terms of our finances, for example. So there was that obligation, there's a responsibility that I have to hold up to, and knowing that I was not as perfect as I would like to see myself to be, which is of course a myth, that crushed me years ago. And then I started to get to know of the actually neurodivergent Slack community, and it was just a space where I can say how my day is going, how manic I am today, or how depressed I am today, what's a certain experience that I've had. And I saw other people talk about theirs too, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was not alone. At first, I was like part of a group that was really secret and just reading things. But when I see this within the workplace community, I was like, there are so many people here and in other spaces that cannot express what they have. And I think it will be good for other people to see something in me that they cannot see day to day. So then I was inspired. So I guess in terms of practices and experiences, number one, a community where your neurodivergent employees or workforce can really be themselves. Number two, trainings, of course, because outside that Slack community is still ourselves living our day to day, and having our colleagues understand what being neurodivergent is very important. So trainings that are made available to everybody is really it will really be helpful. And finally, of course, programs, accommodations, reasonable accommodations that can be provided to each individual based on what they need, not based on what they are diagnosed for, but based on their specific need.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, because that's something I think that resonates across every single person in the workplace, right? If the policy or practice or accommodation is not, or process of accommodation is not set up to address the needs of that individual human, you're just blanketing stigma right over the thing that you're trying to eliminate, right? Carolyn or Michelle, would either of you? Yeah?
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually kind of really happy to talk about a policy that Dow introduced that honestly is really been a game changer. And I think this came out of, the pandemic and people working from home. So, I think it's a game changer because it's not just about people with disabilities. It just recognizes the fact that everybody has different needs in the workplace and how they set up their work schedules. So we have this program called Design Your Day that was launched by Dow. It allows people to literally do that. So I don't want to call it flexible scheduling because obviously depending on the role you have, you'll have different needs. I work in the lab, so I have to kind of plan going in the lab, and like sometimes I will work from home when I need to do deep work. And I think that's like a huge game changer because, like I said, it helps everyone. It helps people who maybe are parents and they want to have time to pick up their kids. It helps folks with disabilities who need to design their workspaces and schedules accordingly. So I think just recognizing that we all think differently, our brains work differently, and we all have different needs, as was mentioned. Can be a game changer. And then I think the second piece is, think what I've learned from going through the accommodations process is that, yes, you can dim the lights in the workplace, you can make lab goggles that will, block out light, but I think the game changer to me is having inclusive leaders. I can say right now, I have an amazing manager. I brought my diagnosis to him. I sat down with a, presentation and I sorted out what my autism looked like and what my needs were. And, we've been having this two-way dialogue where he's really, trying to understand my experience. And I can say that I think that can mean so much more than some of the very simple accommodations that we talk about, is literally just having leaders willing to listen, learn, and lead. And, I think that's something that we really need to emphasize a lot more, is just having a leader willing to create spaces for neurodivergent employees. And in fact, there's also studies that show if you are really good at managing neurodivergent employees, you're going to be really awesome at managing everyone as a whole. So I think we should really emphasize, putting the right people in positions of power.
Can we give a little round of applause for that, please? Thank you. That's absolutely on point. And I think in my experience personally as well, if it wasn't for that ally manager, senior leader who said, thank you for disclosing, thank you for the vulnerability, I got you, right? And then having those policies that back you up, that are autonomous, that you don't have to continuously disclose, similar to the processes that we go through in regard to self-ID and things like that, right? We don't have to tell them. We don't have to tell anybody anything. We just want to be able to function and be our best selves in the workplace. Michelle, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so with the topic of self-ID and accommodations, like I mentioned earlier, it's pretty common for autistic people in general, but also autistic people born as women, to be severely underdiagnosed because of how it differently presents. And with that in mind, some people don't know that they're autistic but are having the exact same challenges, so they don't have the benefit of being even able to self-ID to have access to those things. So decreasing barriers will really increase wellness for everybody and better productivity. But additionally, I just want to touch on casual dress code has been a game changer for me. I'm not hugely sensitive with clothes, with sensory-wise, but there are people that are. But even for me, if I'm already kind of getting to a not great overwhelming point, then clothes can kind of push me over. And I can only describe it as like, I can feel every single thread touching me, and it feels very overwhelming. And so having more flexibility in what I can wear, for example, like wearing like a slip dress instead of something super scratchy or different materials, has been immensely helpful. Also, neurodivergent people, there is an income disparity and higher rates of unemployment. So anything that decreases the barrier wealth-wise for buying into clothes will benefit the neurodivergent community as well.
Thank you so much for that. I think too, when we start talking about those added accommodations and that importance of having the open dialogue, but not having to be forced, again, another correlation between the two communities, right, is that coming out in disclosure. As I just mentioned, it took me a long time actually to have that conversation with that senior manager. Walking into IBM in 2014, it was very easy for me to walk in there with my big glittery self and say, I'm here, I'm queer, let's have some fun in cybersecurity. Welcome to the non-technical adjacent person and the queer in the room. But my neurodivergent self was not brought up until right before COVID hit. And as I've mentioned in previous conversations, if anyone was here in the room yesterday, throughout that discovery process, I ended up identifying autistic burnout. That was an 8-month process to bring myself back. Through doing that was then, and having that support, but also having the option to disclose where and how I wanted to, was the game changer for me to tiptoe back in. And then the added component was being able to be hybrid and not having to be on performing all the time on stage, literally or figuratively, right? And not having to mask and cover continuously. To be honest, I've been doing it since the moment I stepped foot into Vegas. So it can be very overwhelming, and those decompression moments in our workspaces of having that closed Slack channel for actually autistic and actually neurodivergent people to have conversation, self-diagnosed or diagnosed, everybody welcome. And then open ally conversations to support those, but not have to be the poster child all the time. And we can feel that in our own communities within LGBTQ plus as well. So leaning into that coming out in disclosure, I'd like to touch a little bit on how workplaces, or suggestions that workplaces can balance being open with creating that safe environment for all, so we're not doing that come out conversation and adding pressure to folks who are already feeling quite compressed. Jace, could you lead us off?
Yeah, I think number one, it's really important that managers have the skills to empathize and are really inclusive leaders. Because when I got my diagnosis, the only one person that I told was my manager, only because I had to. Because being bipolar can mean that there are so many times that I feel like I'm invincible. I can take in so much work. I can do all the things all the time, regardless of what you give me. And so I realized I had to tell her that I have bipolar, and that means that I will keep on taking what you give me. And eventually, of course, that will result to burnout. And so I need your help so that I can regulate myself in times that I cannot do that myself. So that was years ago. That was the only person that I told. And then until recently, Lindsay here, my now manager, then peer, actually was able to encourage me to talk more about myself. Just because of the way she is, as you can see. So it was really important that was drawn out from me, not because I was forced to, but because I can, and that I have to for my own well-being. So managers who can really keep things confidential and understand you will really go a long way. And of course, the community that I talked about earlier, it doesn't really force you to come out as anything. It just lets you share your experiences day to day. So you don't really have to be out to the company per se, but if there are those spaces, then that's all I need. That's all we may need.
And it's that snowball effect, right? Like if I hadn't had that senior manager that said, I got you, you're good, and gone through the burnout myself, which had nothing to do with the previous, and gone through those learning experiences, I wouldn't be the manager leader that I am to be able to support you. So it's that snowball effect from the ally component again, from the folks where we may not see ourselves up there beyond glass ceiling or what have you, but being able to have that level of education and enablement there, and just level of understanding. This isn't just acceptance. This is understanding and full inclusion, right? Michelle?
Yeah, so for me, creating a safe environment really boils down to really rethinking what a job description is and its duties. Like, does every single job need to present? Does every single job need to be top, like 10 out of 10 at talking to people? Does every single job need to have very consistent 8-hour work days? So just really taking a moment and saying, what do I actually need from this role? And having a very descriptive list that is accurate and not just really vague of what they need in that role, so that somebody who's looking for a very specific type of job can then find it instead of having to sort through 10, 11 plus jobs to only find out that it's not a good fit for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Carolyn?
Okay, so we're talking about coming out in disclosure.
Coming out in disclosure.
All right. I have to ask because we could talk about this for like hours. I think it's really important for people to understand that those are very different, or they can be very different experiences. So, I feel like since I started at Dow, I've been through the process of coming out as queer, then coming out as non-binary, and then, coming out as autistic. And, sometimes in some spaces I'm out as all three, in other spaces I'm out as non-binary, in other spaces I'm out as autistic. And I think that's kind of important because there's different stigmas that go along with each of those. And I bring that up because I think it's really important to understand how to you can't understand how to create a safe space if you don't understand the challenges and stigmas involved in doing so. So I kind of just want to highlight some of the challenges with the disclosure of an autism diagnosis and why people have been so concerned about that. Really is a misunderstanding of what autism is. We've had very negative representation in media. Often it's a white cisgender man who looks like Rain Man, and it really excludes so many other communities. We've had people think that we're not good with people. We have no personality. We can't interact with people. We can't have meaningful relationships. So as you can hear what I'm saying is there's been a lot of can'ts limiting us. I'm a scientist, but I'm also an artist. I paint. I play the violin. I have a lot of other interests that aren't narrowed to, the stereotypes we associate with autistic people. And I think that's important because, in creating a safe space, I want to be in an environment where someone looks at me and I'm not infantilized or treated like a child. And people look at me and they don't think, oh, I need to give this autistic disabled person, this type of a job because they're limited. And I think the way of thinking about it is I don't think we should limit people based on our limited knowledge. I think we really need to give people the opportunity to become what they want to be, and to really see what that looks like, because there's been a lot of reports about autistic people, even the people who are nonverbal, and they have amazing skills. We just have to be open-minded and willing to see what they are capable of. And so that really is what is required to create a safe environment. It's being open and willing to take advantage of all the resources you have in your employees and to not limit disabled people and thinking they can't rise, that they cannot become leaders, that they can't interact with clients. It's about replacing that with a can and saying, this is a person and I'm going to understand them and I'm going to do what I can to bring out the best in them. So that's really what I think.
Great work. Thank you so much, Carolyn. When we talk about the components within our LGBTQ plus community and commonalities within the neurodivergent autistic community, we're not going to be diving into a lot of the science here. But there are multiple studies that have been done over the last decade or more, and I'm happy to see and say that there's more coming. Not enough yet, but it's coming. The basis commonalities, though, are a lot of Band-Aid and societal assumption solutions in throwing therapies and techniques and items out there, be it out in the workplace, but also out in our communities, where you are less than, you have something wrong with you, your behavior is bad and needs correcting, versus taking a look at the gray area. And then the comparison again across our gender diverse and genderqueer individuals and diagnoses within LGBTQ plus over the age of 20. And at present, youth numbers are rising and rising and rising across diagnostics. So it's something that I think folks really need to start taking a look at further, again, from that human component and stop segregating into buckets. We love labels. Most people love labels. And need labels a lot of the time, right, in order to get what we need across accommodations in the workplace, across getting through education and all of these things. And we look at those across both of our expansive communities. But at the end of the day, as again I mentioned yesterday, becoming allies and accomplices for each other across those communities and elevating the persons with disabilities communities and invisible disabilities communities such as ND and ASD within LGBTQ+, the amount of people just sitting in this room right now is, I'm like gobsmacked at the amount of people that want to actually listen to what we're talking about. And that's a realization even for me as we're having this conversation in regard to that allyship and accompliceship and how we're supporting one another. So I'd love to hear from these fantastic panelists on advice to our neurotypical, amazing queer community members on how they can better support us within the neurodivergent community. Michelle?
Yeah, so this conference has been amazing to just know that I am around like-minded and safe people. It's been great. I've never been less stressed about getting dressed in the morning. It's been fantastic. Thank you. But having that space outside of here would be so nice. And for the autistic part of me, the only queer spaces that I know of in my community are clubs, which are great to have a space to let loose and have fun. But there's bright lights, crowds, loud noises, and so those spaces aren't really accessible to me. And let's have a queer cat cafe, you know? So just diversifying the spaces that we can join together and empower each other would be awesome. So also just, if somebody says something that you don't quite understand or that sounds rude, just ask them. And if they say that, yeah, I meant it like that, then file that in your pocket. But sometimes it might just be a misunderstanding, and then you learned about a new communication style. So just don't assume, ask.
Thank you. Jace?
A quick story. There was one time a teammate of mine approached me and told me, "Why have you always been so rude to me? When you talk to our other team members, because I was the manager, you're very nice, but whenever you talk to me, it's like you hate me," is what she said. Well, first of all, I appreciated the candor because at least I know that that was her perspective. So my response was first to apologize if ever I had offended or made her feel bad. And then I go on and told her that I didn't really mean it to be that way. I do have bipolar, and there maybe in those times of interactions, I'm really in a manic level where I get so irritated so fast. And I guess the message was, if you can take in things that it's not about you, it will open you up to more things, right? It's sometimes, or most of the time, it's never about you. It's about what that person is experiencing and going through, and trying to understand that would go a long way. So yeah, it's very simple. Think that it's not about you.
Thank you. Carolyn?
Yeah, so I think a good way to think about it is thinking, I guess, when I think about these questions, I always like to deconstruct and think about them, and I organize that in my head, so I'm explaining my thought process. So when I think about support for the neurodivergent community, I first think about what would it look like for non-LGBTQ folks to support us? Well, I think that's a different experience, right? I mean, depending on your, what other identities you might hold. So, we, as an LGBTQ community, we teach people principles of how to be allies to ourselves. And I really think that many of those tips are things we can carry forward into being better allies for LGBTQ neurodivergent folks as well. So I guess what I'm saying, we've already written the handbook. We just have to learn how to transfer that knowledge towards supporting our community. And I think that comes a lot with education, and it comes a lot with understanding. I think the organization of this panel has honestly been very insightful, and I think a really great opportunity for everyone. I want to, first say thanks to Out and Equal for, number one, providing us a voice, because I think often, as Michelle was saying, we're not always included in many spaces. It can be hard for us because we do have certain sensory needs, so some spaces maybe are, more hard for us to, maybe not as accommodating. So first, thanks Out and Equal for giving us a voice on this platform. Second, I want to just say thanks to Jen and the people who organized this, because I think throughout this process, we've really needed allies. And there's been I've had an ally in Lindsay in helping to really advocate for, the fact that as we both are neurodivergent, but we have different needs, and, her stepping in, and, when we we've asked for what we've needed, her being, putting her foot down and saying like, yes, this is, needed. Just having, working with the staff to get the lighting set up, being able to provide feedback to Out and Equal and then being responsive to that. So, if you want to learn how to be an ally to the neurodivergent community, I think the organizers maybe have learned a lot from just doing this with us, and I think they've done a great job in the fact that I think it really comes down to listening and acknowledging and realizing it has to always be a two-way dialogue. So yeah, I don't know if that was helpful, but I think this panel is a good microcosm of what it looks like to be an ally to our community.
Thank you. I'd just like, if everybody's okay, just to share a little bit about our experience yesterday in setting up. And then we've actually made fantastic time. A few of us were a little worried that we were going to ND info dump and not get through 2 questions. So this has been fantastic. So throughout the process yesterday, just to dive into that a little bit more, and to mention Jin again, I don't know where you are. There you are. Can we have a round of applause for Jin Nugent, please? Thank you. So the team came in quite open-minded. I had a fantastic first conversation at Expo back in March and April with Erin, Isabel, and Dina, which is how this kind of came to be. But Jin jumped in with both feet in understanding and wanting to understand and learn what's going to work for you. And for you as in individuals, not for you as in a blanket community. And that alone has been incredibly supportive. Yesterday we came in and we're working with the sound team and the lights team. We were able to support and create exit plans, which I'm telling you is a reality. I do it all the time. Don't ever try to take me to a dentist. I will run out into my car. So having those types of safe holds set up adds to the psychological as well as physical safety component. Having this curtain over here, which I know folks you can't see us from home, but has a chair in a safe space set behind it. So if we needed to decompress for sensory reasons or feelings of being overwhelmed, we could do that. Yesterday alone, when we were leaving breakfast, walking in the hallway felt like a vice on my head. And I was so very grateful for my friend Sia Justice, who kind of pulled me aside and got me out into some air and got me out of that. We were able to come up on the stage and share that experience. We were able to play with the lighting until it was comfortable enough. We were able to have a walkthrough of the space, plus a rehearsal time this morning. Those added, again, considerations, that mindfulness, giving people the grace to meet them where they are in the moment and provide them what they need without having to just go above and beyond in regard to disclosure in order to justify or defend what somebody needs in that moment, can change the perspective on an individual. Can add that person's just self-confidence for a day. For me, it's just been resoundingly supportive. So thank you to everyone and thank you to Jin. Yes, Michelle?
To just add something onto that, it was a fantastic experience, but we're neurodivergent people on a neurodivergent panel. So I just want to emphasize that, let's keep this momentum going, I'm neurodivergent, but I'm also queer, and I am passionate about many other topics affecting our communities. And it'd be great if I could have those same accommodations in those other spaces, because my perspective is as valuable as others in those too, and I need a chance and help to voice my opinion there.
So with that, I think we will start with a virtual question. No? Okay. Does anybody in the audience have any? Oh, hands. Okay, well, I'll do the front first so we can hear you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Jazz, like the music. I work with Sia Justice under Raytheon Technologies. Thank you for presenting on this panel. I think I learned a lot, and I was really looking forward to this one. So my question is, I'm also a queer woman. You guys were talking about people who are born female are often misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And I just kind of I don't know, I've wondered if I'm neurodivergent before. Could you explain maybe a little bit how it's misunderstood or how it's presented differently in women, so that we can learn more about how that shows up.
Sure. Do we want to describe just a little bit of a personal experience on how that's happened versus kind of
Yeah.
blanketing it over?
Yeah.
So for me personally, it was as a child and then up into 17, being misdiagnosed with multiple mental health issues and illnesses, being mismanaged and severely medicated for things that I didn't need in order to manage the too loud, too busy, too fast, too much. Sit down, you're fine. Right? She's a girl, she's emotional. So a lot of that was the first 17 years of my life was a lot of that. Then having a diagnosis in my 20s of ADHD changed everything, especially going into post-secondary and becoming an educator. Having the connection points there, although late, were really helpful. But again, if I had had that back when I was about 8 or 9 years old, my education itself would have been vastly different, especially secondary school. Fast forward into my 30s, and my psychologist is throwing the word autism at me quite often. And I'd already been in the environment for a really long time as an advocate, as a parent, as an educator. But it didn't actually fully resonate with me in understanding because I'd already been sitting and masking and covering for so long and kind of diving my own ASD-ness into advocacy in place of taking a look at what was happening with me. So I did myself a disservice a little bit, to be honest. And that was as a result, I believe, of the stigma that I received growing up. I'm just too fast, I'm too emotional, right? Things like that. I process differently, but that's something I have to fix. So it was really the mentality in there. I don't know anybody in my tight circle who was born and identifies as female over the age of 30 that hasn't had a diagnosis over the age of 30 because they went through a similar experience that I did in the 80s and 90s. Caroline, what about you?
Yeah, so I think mine's, there's definitely some similarities. I think it's a little bit different being non-binary because I feel like, my non-binary, queer, and autistic identities, they very much overlap. So, growing up, I was very much, I liked wearing my brother's jeans because they were more comfortable. I liked getting the hand-me-downs, that was great. I was into playing with trucks, and I was also, liked dolls or whatever. But I think there were some early signs. Probably one of the earliest signs was my mild obsessions. I went through a phase of being very obsessed with dolphins. I collected everything in our house that was related to dolphins, books, stuffed animals, learned every fun fact. I even, as a 7-year-old child, I dressed up as a marine biologist for Halloween, while all my other friends were dressed up as Sailor Moon and those types of things. To be honest, I think it's a bit funny my parents didn't suspect it. I did have some speech impairments that I had a list, but I still have that. My mom worked extensively on trying to, kind of almost cover up, the defects, seeing the strengths and being very gifted and talented, but covering up the defects. And I think similar to you, Lindsay, I also went through some periods as a teenager. I fell in love with the violin, and when I mean fall in love, that was my special interest, to the point that I ended up, it was a very intense time as a teenager, dealing with, going through puberty and some of the, hormone changes. It caused me to suddenly start experiencing all these incredible sensory things that were going on, which led to me having a lot of challenges with self-harm and cutting, and even going through a lot of, feeling like I couldn't connect, not belonging, and having suicidal ideation throughout my life. So I think a game changer for me was during my postdoc at Caltech, which maybe should tell you maybe I am neurodivergent. I did a PhD in chemistry. I obsessed about chemistry from the age of 17 until, now in my 30s. So maybe that should have been another sign. And then, having a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of not understanding relationships. A friend was who had a nephew who was autistic, was I want you to take this test. And it was a test for facial recognition, and I completely failed it, and that was very surprising for me. I realized I had been reading faces wrong the whole time. I had been reading people's mouths and not their eyes, and that was kind of kind of ground shaking. And so I starting to putting these pieces together. I started doing small things for myself. And I think that's important because I know getting diagnosis is hard. It can be expensive and challenging, but there's still if you suspect that you might be neurodivergent or have similar issues, there are things you can do to support yourself now. And I think that's what I started doing by having structure and trying to take care of my sensory overload. And I can tell you my mental health is I'm really happy now. I'm just wow, this whole reason I felt suicidal because I didn't belong in this world, that's not even a thing now. So, in that sense, that's kind of been my diagnosis. And I did get diagnosed. You go through a childhood history. You do these tests, which to be honest aren't really well designed for adults. But even when I did the testing portion, which is the ADOS test, that was surprising because they make you do very simple things. And as I mentioned, I have a PhD in organic chemistry. So my brain works very well, but when they ask you to do very simple things and you feel exhausted, you're well, yeah, maybe I do really have autism. So, sorry, that was my long-winded info dump of a story.
It's appreciated, thank you. Michelle, would you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, so my brother is suspected neurodivergent. He is not diagnosed with anything. I don't think that he's even aware. So I moved around a lot when I was growing up. In the first 14 years, we moved 7 times. And so I kind of had a master class in masking and just becoming whatever was needed in my environment. Around that same time, my brother was severely bullied to the point where there was physical threats and actual harm done. And so I learned from a very early age that being different in those spaces meant unsafety. And so I did everything in my power to not be that. I was whatever that is, I'm just going to be the opposite, and just learned how to become everyone else in the world besides myself. Then fast forward to adulthood, and one of my cousins asked me if my brother was autistic. And I was I don't think so. No one's ever mentioned that to me, but let me Google it. And I read the symptoms. I was oh, that's interesting to know. But I was no, I pictured a Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. I was that's not me, so we're fine. I just kind of shoved it down further. And then it kind of just sat in the back of my mind for a couple of years. And during those 2 years, I went to therapists. I went to 2 therapists before I got diagnosed. Neither of them even brought autism up. The first one legitimately diagnosed me as an empath. If you Google it, it is not a real diagnosis. And then I got diagnosed with anxiety because scripting can come across as obsessing over situations, and I do actually have social anxiety because I have no idea what's happening around me. So there are some overlaps, but it was a misdiagnosis. And eventually I was okay, I'll just take a bunch of internet tests, which are not conclusive, but are really good at pointing in a direction to continue looking into. And I brought it up to my therapist, and they were I have no idea about this. You did not give me any signs of this, but if you want to pursue it, let's do it. And then since I went to 2 therapists and neither of them noticed it, it's really important to bring up that most mental health professionals do not have any idea about autism. And so if you go to one and you're hey, I have these things, diagnose me with something or not, then a lot of times they won't even consider it if you don't meet the very stereotypical signs. So if you are thinking that it could be that, you're going to have to make a bunch of phone calls, talk to a bunch of people, and find a psychologist that actually has experience in adult autism specifically. And they are few and far between, and people sometimes have a year waiting. So getting a diagnosis is really difficult, and you're going to have to put in a lot of work to get it. So that's why self-diagnosis is valid, because not everyone has the access to those resources. But yeah. I was lucky, and here I am.
Yeah, very good point. In terms of the challenges that we have and the support that workplaces can provide, our employee assistance program, if we can help our employees find those specific specialists, that can go a long way. Just to add to answer to that question, I think I reached the point that I wanted to get a diagnosis, not only for myself, but because of the people around me. Because it's starting to be more difficult for them as well. When I thought I was just raised this way to have a very loud voice, to have so much energy all the time, no, it was already affecting the people that I love. So I went in and got that diagnosis, and I think I'm at a point where I'm still not convinced that this is all I have. Because when I learn about neurodiversity, I'm starting to personally believe that there are more neurodivergent people than there is identified. So I would think that a lot of us resonate with some of the experiences that we've heard today, and I think I'm in that journey right now of self-discovery as well.
I think we can do one, there's one over here, I think, that came up quite early too. Can we do this one first? I just want to make sure we go around the room.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Hey, y'all, my name is Billy. Carolyn, you mentioned a term earlier where you identified as neuroqueer. And it made me think of a book that I read recently where the author described their gender identity being intrinsically connected to their autism. And I'd never heard that term before, so I was wondering if that resonates with you or if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time I can talk a little bit about that because I think that is kind of cool. So there's a really, I guess if you want to learn more about like where some of these terms come from, there's an autistic scholar who wrote this book called Neuroqueer Heresies. So that's like one of the places where that comes from, and it's pretty much is kind of. So I mean, like the art of queering is like, kind of freeing ourselves from heteronormative expectations. And so when we think about what neuroqueer means, I see that as a concept of freeing ourselves from neurotypical expectations. And so, with the whole relationship between gender and, sexuality and my autism. There's some other words, like I say non-binary, but really, I also would say I'm gender fluid, gender vague, sometimes agender. To me, gender is kind of nonsensical. Like my brain finds it funny and illogical. And I mean, that's been true. Like I mentioned, for myself, gender, when I was, presenting as a woman, I felt like it was a caricature. It was a costume I was putting on. I kept trying to make the facial expressions in the mirror and failing. I kept trying to dress super femme, but yet I was in spaces where I acted very masculine and people would comment to stop being so hyper masculine. You don't need to be so machismo. And I'm like, but I'm not. I'm just being myself. So that I think connected to the autism in the sense that I feel like there isn't necessarily this concept of gender. It's kind of like being autistic, you don't socialize in the same way as a neurotypical person. And the concept of socialization is very different. And the concept of how you form human relationships is very different. So that's something I've been coming to terms with. So, like my story, it's like, I also came out as LGBTQ a lot later in life because I had been, it was always like men initiating things with me and me not understanding what it meant to choose for myself. I didn't understand what desire looked like until I fell in love with a woman. We were not together, but she was, that was a game changer for me because I was like, oh my God, like I just didn't understand what human relationships looked like. And also, women often have kind of subtle body language. So I probably, was actually very attracted to women, but I just wasn't able to connect. So I think in thinking about neuroqueer, it is kind of this encompassing experience that explains that, being autistic, how that ties in, like how you perceive your gender and how that affects the way you interact with humans and how that explains the complexity of your LGBTQ identity, because, I haven't even talked about like romantic versus sexual attraction. So it kind of makes this kind of big expanse that I think really comes down to the fact that the way we socialize is different, and I feel often not part of the quote unquote shared reality. So I hope that was helpful. I felt maybe that was a bit of info dumping, but that's maybe someone else wants to answer that.
Yeah, I think the term neuroqueer as well is new in a lot of these spaces, but not necessarily new in a lot of our spaces. So it's something that's been talked about and used as a frame of reference for a really long time in expansive community. It's really why I ended up leaning towards queer as an identity in the first place. So I think it just adds that added element of expansive dialogue and understanding that not everything is black and white, and we can ditch the binary across a lot of things in our lives, right? One more question here in the front, I think.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Obviously, we all have different experiences. And when you were answering the first person's question, I just was surprised that one of the things said wasn't that things like ADHD and autism were studied and are still defined based on traits found in young white boys.
Yes.
And one of the reasons that people who are born assigned female at birth, socialized female, tend to come to diagnoses late in life is because it presents differently and because then who was studied. I got my diagnosis about a year ago, and I pointed out to 6 of my friends, hey, you might want to go and get this looked into. And every single one of them came back with an ADHD diagnosis.
Yeah.
Every single one of them is now on medication and doing worlds better, and they credit me. And I say, it shouldn't be like this, right? Doctors should know, teachers should know, parents should know that it presents differently in different kids, and it doesn't look one way. So from the perspective of somebody who has ADHD, I wasn't the boy child bouncing around because they had too much energy, but I did chase topics based on interest, and I did really well in school, which is not necessarily the male or AMAB presentation of that. And so I would just say look into that also if you're suspecting that you might be neurodivergent and you're AFAB.
Thank you for that. And it's true. I think the majority of medical studies when it comes to behavior and even across general illness, women or other representation aside from boy or man was never considered. Like, these books were all written after studies of specific individuals and not nuanced and multi individuals, which adds to the medical field itself being blind to a lot of this stuff because all they know is what they know in the book, right? So the more that we can have these dialogues, I find too, in having this specific to the workplace, everything in regard to diversity and inclusion and advocacy across the workplace, I'm seeing that then resonate and make changes within those other external fields when we start advocating across benefits. When we start, benefits alone, I mean, we talked about EAP you brought up with employee assistance plans and things like that. Adding executive functioning, not putting a cap on your mental health support and psychology within your benefits packages provides a massive opening for neurodivergent and autistic community, and that we're not going above and beyond paying $10,000 to somebody who may or may not have the right diagnosis, and then you walk away with you're an empath, right? But again, it comes right back to exactly your point, is that they're all based off, like, we're not gonna get into DSM-5 and everything else, but it was all based off of those original studies, right? And as we work together on the advocacy component to change, it does take time, but I'm starting to see studies in some of those come out and change more often. I'm really happy to see that there has been an increase in understanding what the nuances of what neurodivergency and what autism look like without the stereotypes of the Rain Man comparison and things like that Carolyn mentioned earlier, and what you were speaking of as well, earlier. In my own experience, I've seen this also tied to education, as well as specifically to STEM education when they're targeting STEM for girls and things like that, ages 8 and up. I'm seeing more and more folks start taking a look at things from a broader spectrum of, again, these are careful considerations and grace that everybody learns differently, everybody wants things differently, everybody's going to respond to things differently, and we can't just go by the book that's been there since 1971. Michelle.
On that same vein, the book is written by people, and the people that are diagnosing are people, right? And we live in a patriarchal, cis male, straight, white society, right? And so those same disparities are going to show the definitions that they write and the diagnostics that they make. So it's not only women that are left behind, it's also BIPOC people, trans people, everyone.
So we absolutely have run out of time. A couple of us will stick around if we can. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you all so very much for just being here and wanting to take part in this conversation. Thank you to everyone here on the panel.
Can we take a selfie before we go?
Yes.